today is my friend and also a member of the QIAT leadership team, Jane Korsten. This is Jane's first time participating in one of these QIAT webinars, so welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
Good to have you with us today.
Good.
I was supposed to introduce myself, and already I've forgotten to do something. So I'm Gayl Bowser. I'm an independent consultant in the area of assistive technology, and I've been a member of the QIAT leadership team since its beginning. How about you, Jane?
My name's Jane Korsten. I have a degree in elementary education and a graduate degree as a speech pathologist and audiologist. I've worked with in a public school setting with about 28,000 students, first as a speech-language path serving the special needs students, and then later as an AT team member. I was a principal investigator on an innovative research grant funded through the National Institutes of Health, and that led to Every Move Counts, co-author with Terry Foss, who presented the last one of the webinars, and also co-author in Every Move Counts, Clicks, and Chats with Terry. And with How Do You Know It, How Do You Show It, co-author with Gayl Bowser and Penny Reed. And I do professional development now, and as Gayl said, have been a member of the Quality Indicators leadership team since the beginning. So today we're talking about consideration, as Gayl mentioned. Gayl, did you? Okay.
We're talking about implementation.
Yes, and it is the fifth in the series. And as we talk about implementation, I think there are a lot of common errors that occur with implementation, and we experience them in a number of ways. Sometimes team members assume that everybody understands what needs to happen and knows what to do. And I think we've all been in that situation before. Or that the plans for implementation are developed by one team member, and it's the expectation that they will carry out that goal. And I think the classic example is if it's a communication concern, that the speech pathologist will be the one taking care of it, or if it's access, that it will be the OT's job. Often the team focuses on getting the equipment, but not on really looking at what the implementation needs to look like. Sometimes that implementation plan is developed that's incompatible with the instructional environment, or no one has taken the responsibility for taking care of and maintaining the equipment so that it's in working order when it's needed, or often there are not contingency plans in place for those occasions when it doesn't work. And so those are the kinds of things that as we talk today about implementation, that we're looking at those common errors and ways to have strategies in place so that we don't have those kinds of things happen. Gayl?
Yeah, so all of the quality indicator areas, but I think this one more than any of the others sort of started with this identification of common errors. As we started to try and identify what were the essential components of high-quality assistive technology services, and in this case, high-quality assistive technology implementation, we looked at this, the list of common errors that, as Jane described it to you, and we felt that it was important enough to put those common errors into the actual QIAT document, which you can download in full from the QIAT website. So each area discusses those common errors. One of the things that we'd like to do before we go any farther is to find out who you are. So here's a poll for you. You can click on your role. Hopefully you can see that, and you can click on what your role is. I see people are filling out the poll as we speak. And once you have clicked on your role in this poll, excuse me, you will be able to see the graph of people signing in to this to this poll, and you can see that about a third of the folks on this webinar today are assistive technology specialists, have a lot of speech and language clinicians, and a lot of OTs and PTs, and teachers and educators. For those of you who are librarians and family members, that's so important to have your involvement. So I'm always thrilled to see you sign in to one of these webinars and join us for this kind of content, because you play an important role. I see a couple of people saying, well, I've got more than one role. Andrea says, I'm an AT specialist and an SLP. If you haven't already filled in the poll, I want to just encourage you to pick the one that you want to be today, and we'll do that. A lot of AT specialists, about a third of the people in the group. I'm going to close this poll. We've got a couple people signing in still, but let's close this poll. There's our results, and let's go on. We have one other poll right now that I think probably as presenters will give us more information even than what your role is. So the question is, how much of the work you do relates to AT? And if you click that and submit it, we don't have anybody yet who said, I don't work with AT at all, so that's very cool. It's always nice to have an audience that has some background. And lots of people who say most of my work involves AT. I love these polls. We already have 114 people who have responded out of 150 on the call. So we'll let it go just a minute longer and then close that poll. The percentages are staying very much the same. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to close this poll so that we can go on and talk about the content for today. So there's our graph. And Jane's going to speak just a little bit more now about the general implementation area. So Jane, take it away.
When we talk about implementation, we're talking about the ways that the AT devices and services, as they are included in the IEP, are delivered and integrated into the student's educational program. The implementation involves many people working together to support that student to accomplish the tasks that are necessary for active participation and progress in that customary educational environment. Within implementation, there are 7 areas, and we'll be looking at 7 indicators, and we'll be looking at each one of those indicators, looking at ways to evaluate your own services, and then documents on the website that support that process. So Gail's going to talk about that first indicator area, indicator.
Okie doke. The first indicator in the implementation indicators is assistive technology proceeds according to a collaboratively developed plan. You know, implementation has been one of my passions in assistive technology for some time now, because I really was aware that we have learned over time about good strategies for doing assistive technology assessment. We've been able to describe those to the field, and you have heard already or if you've participated in all these webinars, you've heard about the AT assessment indicators and also the AT consideration indicators. But one of the things that I hear as a consultant who travels all over the country is that things tend to fall apart at the point of implementation. So it's an area that I've thought about a lot, tried to figure out why things fall apart there. And one of the things I think is that we really haven't focused maybe as well as we should on the area of implementation, because we assumed that if teachers and students and parents and everybody involved had the tools that they needed, they would sort of automatically know what to do. So this indicator of having a collaboratively developed plan, and if you look at the intent statement here, a written plan, a written action plan that gives details about who's supposed to do what, seems to me to be a critical step that we may be missing sometimes. Many of you have already been exposed to the QIAT self-evaluation matrices, and this is the first matrix document for the implementation indicators. So you'll see a range of choices from number 1, where if you were self-rating yourself on how things go in your district or in your practice, number 1 is the least promising. There's no implementation plan at all. And then the most promising, that all team members collaborate in the development of an AT implementation plan. Most of us are somewhere in between the least promising and the most promising. I want to say up front that when we rate ourselves in terms of each of these indicators, when we think about program improvement or service improvement, I've never met anybody who said, oh, we do everything at a number 5 level. So this matrix tool is really a tool to help you think about what it would look like if your assistive technology implementation services had all the essential elements that they needed in order to promote effective implementation as much as possible.
And when we did the matrices in our district, it was very enlightening because we first did it, the team members did it on themselves, then we did it as we looked at our team as a whole, and then we had the teachers and therapists we work with look at it. And it was interesting to see the discrepancy sometimes in what we thought we were doing and the way we were perceived by the other people who really didn't always know what was going on at our end of that. So,
absolutely. And sometimes when districts do that kind of comprehensive evaluation of their assistive technology services, you'll see other kinds of discrepancies, like the elementary school teachers say, oh, yeah, everything's really done well, and secondary school teachers may say, oh, not so well. What we have discovered over time is that when there are discrepancies like that, they're well worth looking at, and not an indication that there's something wrong with the self-evaluation matrix, as it is an indication that there are probably silos of excellence and silos of places where things really need more improvement than others. One of our jobs on these webinars is to give you some ideas about what a collaboratively developed plan might look like. So on this slide, you should see the other document that was sent out as a handout today. It's the AT Implementation Plan Management Questionnaire. And this is just one of many possible examples for implementation plans that could be used by the team. So on the cover page of this form, you see items in that chart such as who's going to do the initial student training and when is it going to be done by. And everything from that, who's going to do staff training, who's going to take care of repairs and maintenance. So this is just one form that was developed, actually I think this is my form, to help teams start to think about what are all the components that go into effective implementation. If you have this handout at this point, you will also see that there are 3 other pages that ask some questions for the team to consider. So there are student training questions, equipment considerations, and staff and family training questions. And I'm going to refer back to this form a little bit later as we as we go through the webinar when we get to some of the other indicators. So, but an implementation plan needs to get everyone headed in the same direction. And one of the things that I see as an issue in implementation is that different people have different ideas of what we're trying to accomplish. So part of an implementation plan is to be real clear about what the goals and objectives are for AT use and get everybody on board headed in the same direction with the student. I think we're ready for indicator number 2, Jane.
Well, before we do that, we
want
to talk a bit about the interrelationship between some of the indicators, because in many places, one area will have an indicator that relates to another. And a good example, those of you who listened to the last webinar, which was Terry Foss and Susan McCloskey talking about documentation in the IEP, the 5th indicator there really lays the foundation for the implementation plan. And that IEP is the document that will be seen by the most people. That indicator was that all services that the IEP team determines are needed to support that AT equipment are designated in the IEP. And so if we have done that part of documentation well, we have really laid a foundation for developing that plan that will be shared and understood by everyone. So that is just one example of 2 indicators that do interrelate, and we'll point out a couple of others as we go along. The second indicator that we're going to talk about is that the technology is integrated into the curriculum and daily activities of the students across the environments. It's often, and I know when I started that as the speech path, if it were a communication device, it was supposed to happen when I took the child down the hall into my room, and I was supposed to bring the child back as a proficient OGCOM user. And what we really know from experience is that communication happens all through the day, and that training needs to happen in all of those environments and be integrated across those environments, so that the child has access to that throughout the day. When we look at the matrix for self-evaluation for that indicator, what we find is, again, that range from least promising, where it's included in the IP, but it really doesn't get used. And when we go to the most promising practice part of that equipment is really integrated into the student's curriculum and daily activities. And so in looking at yourself or in looking at your team or how your district integrates the technology, this gives you some pegs to hang your hat on and see what is it you need to do to move to that next area. One example, excuse me, we had a student who was new to the district, and she had been in early childhood programs and was coming into a typical kindergarten setting. And she has significant sensory motor differences. Her initial goals did not address assistive technology as the mother had hoped they would. And she was very disappointed because she felt that without having goals that specifically mentioned the AT, that her daughter would not get access to communication devices and strategies. So Mom was challenged to bring, her goals to the table. And what we see is the flip that everything for the mom was really about the technology. And so in a process of discussion to help Mom see that technology was the tool to help staff understand that Mom's concern was that if she were in a typical classroom, but nothing was being done to incorporate communication and the technology. And so what was developed then was looking at the core vocabulary that went with the activities of the child's day, so that when they were talking about math or talking about science or literacy things, that the student had that core vocabulary presented, and she communicates via partner-assisted scanning with changes in motor patterns and affect. And so they would be able to, if they exposed her the proper vocabulary, go back and evaluate with or without the technology, whether she had the vocabulary that was needed. And so watching the evolution of those goals to something that everyone on the team could be comfortable with as they collaborated on the development of that plan.
So, Jane, one of the things I love about this story is that originally the team really did have some communication-focused goals that didn't mention the technology, as you said. The mom really wanted mention of technology, but this goal that they came to doesn't specifically say anything about the augmentative communication. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Well, from the multimodal forms of communication, what they realized was that her most efficient and effective way of getting information across immediately was the partner-assisted scanning. And that in finding, and they're working on finding access sites for the technology for her to be able to use voice output. But if it became focused on that, she had many fewer opportunities because they didn't know in advance what vocabulary to put in related to every activity that would be happening during the day. And in looking at that multimodal, and they accept there were some activities that were set up for switch use, but they are with a focus towards access, and her content understanding is much more effectively evaluated right now through the changes in affect and motor patterns. So they are building the vocabulary and being able to document what she understands and then move it into her communication device. So they have strategies for identifying what will support her in those curricular activities. Initially, she would be sitting in the room for those activities, but there was no way to hold her accountable for whether she understood the content.
Thank you. That's a wonderful explanation.
So the next indicator is number 3. Okay, there we go. That everyone supporting that child is expected to share the responsibility for implementation of the plan. And again, I think this is so often, and I think we've gotten much, much, much better about it, but I think it again comes back to if it were access, it was going to be OT and PT. If it were, and now we understand that those things happen throughout the day. And so if we look at that matrix again for evaluating, what we can see in least promising is that really nobody owns it. The OT may have written the goal but is not in there with the frequency that it needs to happen, and everyone in the classroom regards it as the OT's goal. But when we get up to most promising practice, we realize that everybody really shares the implementation process across those environments. When we look at that indicator, we find another example of how it interrelates with something else. When we're talking about sharing the responsibility, we also can see that with the IEP team, that all services needed to support are designated in the IEP. So again, we have that document that everyone sees and that was talked about in the last webinar, and it really lays the foundation and supports having that implementation shared across environments. Gayl?
Yeah. So our next indicator is number 4. And this is a little bit different tack on one of the essential components of high-quality implementation planning, which is that the people who support the student provide opportunities for the student to do the identified task, whether it's communication or writing or reading or whatever, with a variety of strategies and tools, including assistive technology, and give the student an opportunity to learn which strategies are the most effective for particular circumstances and tasks. This indicator is aimed at recognizing the fact that it's not just the use of the tool that is inherently important in the assistive technology implementation program, but the use of the tool to accomplish something. The matrix focuses in this area on, if you look at the numbers 3, 4, and 5, the matrix focuses on multiple strategies and helping students to understand when each strategy might be the most effective. So might be the most effective. And what we know is augmentative communication devices, for instance, can be really important. Single switches that talk can be really important, but you can't use those in the bathtub. So what we have to do is help the staff and the student themselves to understand when each tool will be the most effective tool for the situation. And one common error is that people think, okay, now that we've got a communication device, we won't have to use all those other multimodal strategies for assistive technology. You know, one of the things that Jane and I talked about as we prepared this webinar is that we have, in some ways, very different backgrounds. The focus of Jane's work has been on students who have fairly significant disabilities and often multiple disabilities. Not that that's what she's done exclusively, but from my perspective, the focus of my work has been on kids with more academic disabilities. I am by training an old LD teacher. So that has been a benefit to us in the preparation of this webinar. The student that I want to give you as an example is a student named Daniel who was a bilateral amputee. He had no hand on his left arm and a hand with only a couple of fingers on his right arm. So he was in a regular fourth grade classroom, but his work was significantly affected by the fact that he really could not hold a pencil. And we worked on a number of strategies to help him with writing. But initially, we had a problem with Daniel because the school had given him a very appropriate tool, which was a portable word processor. I think it was a Fusion from the Writer Company, but regardless, it was just a basic word processing device that didn't have a lot of other features, but was very portable, and it was one that he could actually pick up and manage in his classroom. They gave him that tool, but then the assumption was that he would use that tool for every writing task, and that's where the implementation started to fall apart. Things started to get much more difficult for him because they were expecting him to use the AlphaSmart to do everything except write his name on the paper. And sometimes that wasn't the most efficient or effective way of doing it. So one of the things that we did to help with the implementation, I see a question from Dallas. I'm going to answer it in just a minute. But one of the things we did to help with the implementation was to identify which tool he would use for which situation. Dallas wants to know why not text-to-speech for Daniel, and that's a very good question. Part of the reason for why not text-to-speech for Daniel was that we were just beginning to teach him to do basic writing tasks. and he was having a lot of difficulty even approaching an assignment, and we wanted him to get used to the idea of doing basic writing tasks before we started to add more complicated technology like text-to-speech. The other reason for that was that he and his parents were both very insistent that he not be removed from his general education classroom. And in that classroom, at the time that we did this plan, we actually felt like it was not going to be possible for him to use text-to-speech because of the noisy environment. Yeah, and I see Stan says text-to-speech can be very difficult in the classroom environment, and that was the main reason at that point. Now, one of the things about good implementation is that we use our data to review what's going on, see if he's making progress, and at some point this team did add text-to-speech for Daniel, but it wasn't the place where they wanted to start. So I want to thank both of you for your questions and comments. I'm trying to watch the chat box as much as possible, so this is probably a good time to encourage you to put in other questions or comments if you want to. And we've got another poll for you.
Gayl has mentioned that she tended to work with more high-incidence students, and on our assistive technology team, I might have to own any of it, but when a student came through with significant sensory motor differences and we were looking for a case manager, I would always be going, pick me, pick me, pick me. So Gayl and I wanted to look at what are some of the tasks that you deal with most frequently, and knowing that you may cover many of those, but what are the most common kinds of tasks that your students might be needing technological support. So if you take a minute and respond to those.
Now, on this poll, you'll see that you could have multiple answers. So we have the percentages are way up over, it looks to me like way up over 200. And we're getting more and more responses. I appreciate you doing the poll. This will be a fun one to use for some of our data, Jane, because it helps us know probably as much as anything who the audience is today.
Yes.
Okay, Gloria's pointing out, while we're doing this poll, Gloria's pointed out that there were some questions on the question tab that we had been missing. So here's a comment from Teresa. Permission to use is listed at the bottom of the forms. Do we need to follow up and do that with this? Oh, so the form that we sent you, no, you have permission to use that. If we send it to you, you certainly have permission to use this form. Lisa asks, how do you address a situation where a student consistently chooses tools that may not be the most efficient or effective? Lisa, I'm going to address that question in the next indicator. And so if I don't answer your question, or if you want to give us a little more feedback after the next indicator, that would be great. But I think that's one of our big concerns in implementation, especially for older students who are more capable and academically involved. So,
Gayl, if I could share one quick story about that, because we had a student who consistently chose the tool that was not the most efficient and effective, and we actually collected the data for him and sat with him and showed him the difference in what his productivity was between the two tools. And he looked at the data and chose to use the one that he enjoyed the most at home, but the one that made him most efficient at school. So data, and Terry and I will be talking about that in the next webinar, can really be your friend in more ways than we think.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that a little more for Indicator 5, which is learning opportunities for the student, family, and staff are an integral part of implementation. We have to do training on the use of the technology, and we have to do professional development. Again, I think this is one of the places where implementation has faltered fairly often in the world because people assume that if we provide a tool to the student and training to the teacher and the family, that everybody will know what to do with it. One of the, so let's look at the matrix first with the same indicator. One of the things that we know from research on professional development is that without follow-up to the initial training that you do, there's likely to be an abandonment of the technology or whatever it is you're trying to teach. So that's true for both assistive technology and many other professional development topics, that we need follow-up and, if at all possible, coaching and mentoring. So that's the number 4 in the matrix, and the number 5 would be that everybody was actively involved in identifying the kinds of training they need and that those opportunities were provided in an ongoing way. One of the most useful paradigms that I've run across in terms of implementation is the aspects of assistive technology competence, which was initially described way back in 1989 by Janice Light. What Janice said, Janice is an augmentative communication specialist. She tends to focus a lot of her work on working with adults who need augmentative communication devices, but her work has had a huge influence on the field of augmentative communication and a huge influence on me as a general assistive technology specialist. What Janice says is that it isn't just about one aspect of using assistive technology. And in this article and in subsequent things that she wrote, she identified 4 different kinds of skills: operational skills, functional skills, which in her initial work was called linguistic skills, strategic skills, and social skills. So part of my job is to briefly describe those for you in the context of this webinar today. And I want to give you at least one story about why that's so important. Operational skills are the skills that help kids and the staff in the school know how something works. So I gave you the example earlier of Daniel, and if you remember correctly, there was a problem with Daniel's AT implementation, even though he had been given training on the operation of his portable word processor. He wasn't using it, or wasn't using it effectively. So one of the ways I use this paradigm is when things aren't going well with implementation, I take a look at each of these skill areas and I ask myself, is there something we haven't addressed in terms of these 4 skill areas? When I did that with Daniel, I said, nope, we taught him how to operate it. The aide that works with him knows how to operate it. The teacher knows how to operate it. So it isn't that. One of the things we tend to do as AT specialists, because we know that many of you on this call are AT specialists, one of the things we tend to do is if the implementation doesn't go well, sometimes we jump immediately to, well, we must need a different device. And actually, a couple of you did that in terms of when we initially talked about Daniel, somebody said, what about text-to-speech? I always encourage people who are working on an implementation program to think first about these 4 skill areas and find out whether the student and the staff in the classroom have the skills they need in these 4 areas rather than jumping to assumption that the device isn't working properly. I see a comment from Joyce. Thank you for your comment, Joyce. I have many students who use portable keyboards in elementary school and see the need. Then they get to middle school and they don't want anything at all and refuse to use it. You know, I see that often. It's a characteristic of middle school students that they don't want to be different. So I have two responses to that right now, and we could have a great 2-hour-long conversation just about this topic. But one of the things that I think is something, Joyce, that you said you already are doing, which is starting early with the technology so that students have data and information for themselves about how well the tool works for that functional area. So in Daniel's case, the functional area was writing. He needed to be able to write sentences, to write short word answers, to write 2 or 3 paragraphs at a time, and there was a term paper at the end of the year that had to be at least 5 pages long, and he needed to be able to do all those things. One of the things that we find out when we give kids appropriate assistive technology is that they may not actually know the functional skills, in Daniel's case, the writing skills that they need in order to use the technology. The other 2 areas on this slide, the strategic skills and social skills, are, to me, one of the places where implementation most often falls down. So, Joyce, with your students who are maybe resisting technology use as they get a little older, one of the things that I think we have to help them do is to identify for themselves when will they use the tool, and when they have multiple options for doing a particular task, which is the best tool for each specific task. I think we have to teach kids that themselves, not only the staff, but we can do that in part by identifying, okay, during, if you're only writing 2 or 3 words, you can do it with a pencil. If you have to write 5 pages, maybe you do get to dictate to an instructional assistant, and you'll see that on that chart for Daniel. The 4th area of skills is social skills, and social skills are the skills that you need in order to use assistive technology around other people. So often those kinds of skills are being able to explain why you're using the assistive technology, or to put the setting, if you need special settings on a classroom computer, to put the settings back to the way everybody else uses them when you're done, things like that. All 4 of these areas, if they aren't addressed in an assistive technology use program, can lead to implementation failure. So I'm talking about Daniel, but Jane's got wants to go back to Dolly and talk about her skills.
Well, and I think the difference for her when we talk about those AT competencies, she has an amazing attention to task, and she will participate and persist in an activity that is difficult for her motor-wise beyond what I think most of us would do. When we look at what those skills, for example, the operational skills, for her right now, what she needs to understand is if I hit that switch, it says this. Someone else owns the rest of the operational skills for her. Someone else turns that device on and off, sees that it's charged and programmed. I would have every expectation that over time, especially with the amazing options we have with technology, that she may become self-sufficient on those other aspects. But right now, it is important for her to understand how it works means that I hit this and it delivers this message. And here is when I do that. And part of that is doing it at an inappropriate time and getting the feedback that this is not your, time to do that. So what those skills look like, depending on that child's abilities and interests, can be quite different. But as we go along, we want to broaden their understanding of each of those skill areas.
And one of the things I love about this paradigm is that it can be applied to any kid at any level of assistive technology use. And the question for the team always is, okay, what's the next thing in each of those skill areas that this student might need to learn?
So in looking at the sixth indicator, what we see is that the implementation is initially based on assessment data and adjusted based on performance data. A lot of times, particularly historically, we would do assessments, but there would be a disconnect between the assessment and what implementation would look like. So that information was gathered on assessment, and then someone wrote an implementation plan that may or may not relate to the data that had been gathered. And adjusting it based on the performance data, that we don't just keep doing something the same way and saying, well, he still hasn't reached criterion, he still hasn't reached. It's looking at what does the data tell us about what we need to change. So again, if you look at the matrix, the self-evaluation matrix, you can find that that least promising is an implementation based on the availability of the equipment and not really on the data that we've gathered through that assessment process. And as we move to the right, we look at that it might be based loosely on that initial data, but it's not really adjusted on the performance data. When we get up to most promising, we are really basing our implementation on the data we gathered during assessment, and that we are consistently and regularly reviewing that data and adjusting our implementation based on the information that we're getting from our implementation data. And this is another example of an indicator that is related to another, and the February webinar, Terry Foss and I will be talking about evaluating the effectiveness of intervention. And we find there that both indicator 5 and 6 under evaluation of effectiveness relate to and have an ongoing impact on that implementation plan. That the data collected provides the teams with a means for analyzing the achievement and identifying the barriers and supports. When a child isn't progressing, our data needs to give us an indication of why it's not progressing. It's not enough to say he's still at this percentage. But does the data provide us with a means of looking and saying, wow, do you realize this? And maybe if we change this, we will have better implementation. And that leads us to the next indicator, that we make changes in that services and program when the data indicates that we need to. And so stepping back and looking at the data regularly, our matrix for that starts with, in that least promising, that the materials are not managed or maintained, that they don't have access to the equipment.
Jane, this one's mine.
Oh, good, because I suddenly realized I was in. Please, go for it, Gayl.
Yeah, so you were talking about the interrelatedness of the indicators in this slide, and as Jane pointed out, those kinds of things come from both these previous slides come from the evaluation of effectiveness indicators, which we'll be talking about next month. How do you do good database decision making? But one of the things about implementation that actually seems very basic, but that we sometimes forget to address, is the management and maintenance of the technology. I have seen more than one assistive technology use program fall apart for lack of addressing some of that management and maintenance of the technology issues, particularly when there are supplies involved or something that needs to be added to the system, but nobody's identified who needs to add it. One of my most and least favorite stories was about a young man that we provided a laptop computer and Kurzweil software and a bunch of high-tech tools at the high school level for his reading and writing, but he suddenly we saw a significant drop in his turning in his assignments. And when we went back and looked at that, what we discovered was that one of the things we hadn't done was really provide him with an adequate way to print the assignments that he was doing on the laptop computer with all the fancy software. And the ending solution to that was an extra printer cable that was attached to the computers in all the different classrooms that he went to, so that he could finish his work in a classroom and print it immediately so that he could turn it in before he left the classroom. Or if it was a homework assignment, he could walk into the classroom, hook up his laptop, and print his assignments to turn in at the beginning of class. On that assistive technology management form that we showed you earlier, I mentioned that there were 3 other pages that just ask a bunch of implementation and questions about several different areas. One was student training, one was staff and family training, and the third area was the equipment considerations. So questions that need to be addressed if we're going to have effective implementation. Things like question number 4, where are we going to put this device in the room when the child uses it? Will the student need to use this device at home? And we know that by federal law, if a student needs to use a device at home to accomplish their IEP goals, we need to make sure that they have it available at home. Will we need to modify the device itself? And some other questions like who will be responsible for device repairs. So hopefully that implementation planning form that we provided you at the very beginning will help you to think about this indicator in a little bit more detail. We want to take just a minute to ask you to fill out this poll. And this poll lists the 7 indicators that we've talked about so far today. And what we were curious about is which of the implementation indicators do you feel are the most important for you to address in your situation? I want to tell you that you can choose more than one indicator before you submit, although I see many of you have submitted already. But we were just curious about, as we went through all these different indicators, whether there was one that really stood out for the members of this audience. And we can...
I'm sorry, Gayl, while they're completing that, I wanted to go back over to the chat line, where one of the questions is, I know of schools or comments where a teacher is familiar with one vendor's AT and sticks to that instead of the data for selecting and ongoing progress with that selection. I think that is a really common thing that occurs in a lot of places, that someone is comfortable with particular technology. And it is a challenge to get them to try new technology. There's also, Kendra had a question about what the federal law requires use at home to be available. And I'll pass that to you.
Oh, okay. Well, that wording is actually in IDEA. It's in the mandate to provide assistive technology. So the wording in IDEA, and I can't give you the citation number, but the wording is each public agency shall ensure that assistive technology services or devices or both are provided as needed for the child. And then there's a a bullet point B in that requirement that says, on a case-by-case basis, if the IEP team decides that the technology is needed at home to accomplish IEP goals, the agency has a responsibility to make sure it's available. So that's IDEA, federal law, and if you need the specific citation, feel free to send me an email, and we'll address that. I'll be happy to give you the wording. Mary Jo said the answer can be significantly different depending on which district I'm in and which team I'm working in. Mary Jo, I'm not sure if that's referring to the federal law requirement or to something else. So if you could put a little bit more in the chat box while we go on, we'll come back to that later if you need more information.
I think looking at the poll results, it's interesting that the two highest indicators are that collaboratively developed plan and the shared responsibility. And I think that underpinning both of those is that opportunity to interact with our colleagues.
Yeah.
And everyone is stressed on time, and often I think we look at when can we meet, when in fact we need to think about when and how can we share the information, because getting everyone together meeting-wise I think is always challenging, and maybe more so now than ever before.
Okay. Jane, we've got about 2 minutes left, and there's one more question that Shannon has asked, but I'd like to save that till last. If you can run us through the QIAT website.
Okay. We'll go through the QIAT website quickly with an invitation for you to go back and look more slowly. The opening page, you'll see the bar across the top. You can find the indicators. You can also find the resources that we have been sharing with you. There is a resource bank, and these are things that have been shared. I think there are over 3,000 people participating at this time, and it is probably the most generous and sharing community you can imagine. And people will post questions, and people step forward with information to share. And so if you go to that website, take a few minutes and look, you can find all kinds of implementation-related things and resources, from the guiding documents down through the different kinds of things. I know, Gayl, you want to do that question. Let's just put up what we hope are your implementation takeaways. And if you want to go ahead to the question about higher ed, then we can come back and close down.
Okay. Shannon asked about the use of the quality indicators in higher education, and there is a spin-off project from the school-age QIAT indicators that's called QIAT-PS, which is QIAT Post-Secondary. You can Google that online, and they have an extensive website with their own set of different kinds of indicators. And Shannon, that's a project that I'm still actively working on. If you'd like to send me an email or ask me some questions about that, I'm happy to work with you. We're actually field testing some of those indicators right now. And I see that Mary Jo said that her question or her comment about things are very different depending on the district she's thinking of was referring to the survey poll, and certainly we know that different districts are very different in that respect. So, Jane?
So we would like to invite you to join us on February 12th. Terry Foss and I will be talking about evaluation of effectiveness of AT. That's that four-letter word.